Welcome to the e-learning center of the University of Hyderabad. This is the MOOCs lesson on the Environmental Humanities, and my name is Pramod K Nayar. I teach in the Department of English of the University of Hyderabad. What is the Environmental Humanities? This relatively new field brings together disciplinary inquiries from the social sciences and the humanities. It includes the traditional forms of criticism such as eco-criticism from literary studies, ecosophy, that's an abbreviated form of ecological philosophies, geography, histories of the environment, and environmental ethics. The necessity of the environmental humanities was brought upon people across these disciplines based on a perceived sense of crisis in the global environment. And the field, as described in the inaugural issue of the journal Environmental Humanities, says its aim is to ask fundamental questions of meaning, value, responsibility, and purpose in a time of rapid and escalating change. We can think of the environmental humanities as embodying a new environmental imagination, by which I am adapting Lawrence Buell's classic work, The Environmental Imagination. This new environmental imagination adopts and adapts insights from a variety of disciplines, which includes the following: multi-species ethnography, human and non-human geography, ethics, social studies of technology, histories of climate change, critical animal studies, and evolutionary biology. As you can see, the range of disciplines is very vast. It includes hardcore biologists working with geographers who want to look at topographies and nature of the environment. It includes newer fields like critical animal studies. It also includes philosophers debating the ethics of, say, animal slaughter or of environmental pollution. It also has a component which is not part of this current talk, but it also includes things like the legal issues around environmentalism. Environmental humanities also includes the employment of new concepts such as the Anthropocene, literary texts which talk about climate change, which include science fiction, popular cultural texts on eco-disasters, and others. The traditional environmentalist approach has been to examine the relationship of human life form with the environment and the ecosystem. The new environmental humanities asks us to do something more, something slightly different. It asks us to look at the relations of non-human forms of life with the environment, the relationship of humans with these non-human life forms, plants and animals, the co-evolution and mutual dependence, such as symbiosis, of various forms of life and the environment. It asks us to examine critically the history of mankind's relationship with the rest of the environment and ecosystem with all its life forms. That being our foundation, let's move on to the key concepts and components of the environmental humanities. Our first one is multi-species ethnography. As a variant of traditional ethnography and cultural geography, multi-species ethnography accounts for what is now called entangled lives, which is the examination of human and other life forms within a given territory, their interactions and mutual influence. It also asks us to look at landscapes and their forms, climate and weather. It rejects the older dichotomy of nature versus culture because it shows that man-made culture cannot be separated from other life forms, the ecosystem, and interrelations. In other words, whatever humans do as part of their cultural practices do have an adverse effect on the environment, the ecosystem, and other life forms. There is no escaping human influence, that is human culture, upon what we think of as pristine, uncluttered culture. Our next key concept is something that has been doing the rounds in the last 10 plus years, the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a demarcation of geological time linked to the dating of the impact of human civilization on the environment. Revived by Paul Crutzen and now widely debated as to where the actual Anthropocene begins, Anthropocene is a history of man's interference, intervention, and influence on the environment. Should this be tracked back to the beginning of human agriculture and settled lives? Should it be tracked back to the 18th century industrialization of Europe? Or should it be traced to the 20th century nuclear age and its advent and the consequences of nuclear testing? Among the effects of the human effects on the environment, we can count the loss of biodiversity, pollution of various kinds, the depletion of resources, and climate change. Critics now study the literary and cultural representations of the Anthropocene in art, music, film, popular culture, and high literature, while experts from other disciplines examine population growth, migration, climate change, etc. Part of this study of the environmental humanities focuses on what is called the critical animal studies. It seeks to move from principles and philosophies of equality and subjectivity to active political work around animals. It speaks of the linkage between various forms of human oppression and human exploitation, racism, sexism, ableism. That is, the argument being, humanity has consistently oppressed people in the name of race, gender, ability, age, and as a result, it also oppresses in the name of species. This is called speciesism, the human oppression over other forms and species of life. The critical animal studies approach argues that the binary of nature culture has resulted in a hierarchy of humans over and above animals and other life forms, a binary that needs to be urgently undone. The argument here is, when humans situate themselves over and above the animal species and other life forms, it naturally tends to an exploitative relationship. Therefore, critical animal studies examines the conversion of animals into objects for capitalism and globalization. It opens up the animal field to exploitation, and the environmental humanities, with its critical animal studies approach, traces a link between discourses of inequality and the practice of, say, animal killing. Demands an ethical commitment to animals, animal rights, and animal welfare. Let's now turn quickly to an illustrative passage out of Octavia Butler, the African-American science fiction writer, from a novel, Adulthood Rights. This is an extract from the novel. The novel, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, has to do with a post-human life, a post-human age when Earth has been devastated and a species of life from another planet come to occupy Earth. The Onkali, as they are called, mate with humans, enable humans to develop new skills, new biological conditions. For instance, their bodies are able to battle cancer. As a science fictional classic, Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy, as it's called, and Adulthood Rights is a part of it, asks us to question our own existence on Earth. Here is the core passage. I quote, "Plastics used to kill people back before the war," a woman said. "They were used in furniture, clothing, containers, appliances, just about everything. Sometimes the poisons leached into food or water and caused cancer, and sometimes there was a fire and plastics burned and gassed people to death." So let's ask ourselves, keeping in mind all that we have said about the environmental humanities, what does this passage tell us? What does it say about mankind's history on Earth? What does it say about the apocalyptic, eco-disastrous condition of the Earth today? Butler uses one example, just one, plastic, to ask us to imagine eco-disaster. And the passage says that plastics were everywhere. They were omniscient. They were part of everyday life to such an extent that even food and water that humans consumed was full of plastic. Plastic was not solely the feature of human culture. They became a part of the ecosystem, a part of nature. The phrase she uses is, "it leached into food or water." You will recall what we have said, that there is no way we can retain the nature-culture binary now, because all that humans do by way of cultural practice has been willy-nilly absorbed and assimilated into natural forms like soil, earth, water, and everything else. The third point is, plastics did not kill instantly. They killed slowly and painfully via things like cancer. Butler's passage in its environmental imagination documents what is called slow violence, Rob Nixon's influential concept from his book of the same name from 2011, where Nixon argues that the violence of environmental pollution and species death is not an event but a process. It occurs over a long period of time, sometimes over centuries. He calls it slow violence because it is inherently violent, but it's not palpable, tangible, till species die. So, Butler's passage talks about slow violence, the leaching of poisons into water and air. It talks about the impossibility of separating nature from human culture and the active human intervention culture and cultural practices in the environment through its actions. It talks about the necessity of recognizing that everyday objects made of toxic materials like plastic are more dangerous than any single event of ecological disaster. In other words, via Nixon we can argue that it is not just a nuclear explosion that kills the earth, that kills nature, it's the slow violence of everyday pollution and everyday toxicity. In other words, Octavia Butler sees eco-disaster as proceeding incrementally, spread over time, rather than as a spectacular, unique event. The point I would like to emphasize at this moment in time is that environmental imagination within environmental humanities asks us to not focus only on one particular dimension but integrate everything. It asks us to pay attention to questions of population and depopulation. It asks us to pay attention to slow violence and incremental toxicity. It asks us above all to seriously examine our ethics towards things like animals, plants and even non-living life forms. That is, we need to pay attention to questions of, say, minerals, the atmosphere and bacteria, all of which contribute to what we understand as the ecosystem. The environmental imagination as manifest in the eco-criticism, ecosophy, ecologically minded animal ethics and critical animal studies is an integrated approach which forces us therefore to pay attention to what is seen as an impending eco-disaster. Now that we have started our exploration of environmental imagination via the environmental humanities, we will extend our study of concepts in part 2 of our first module, What is the Environmental Humanities?